Imagine starting your morning wrapped in absolute calm. The kind of calm that feels earned. The house still asleep. The air untouched by urgency. Pale sunlight creeping through half-drawn curtains, painting slow lines across the kitchen floor. Coffee sits untouched on the counter, steam rising gently, as if time itself has decided to pause. There is no sense of threat and no warning and no hint of chaos. And then, without permission, your phone erupts. The screen lights up again and again. Messages stacking so fast they blur into one another. Missed calls climbing into double digits before the first can even be processed. Notifications vibrating with a persistence that feels almost aggressive. This is not routine news. This is not idle curiosity. This is panic. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself, what kind of story detonates a peaceful morning so completely? What kind of revelation demands attention immediately, before breakfast, before preparation, before defenses can be raised? And what happens when the news breaking is not gossip, not rumor, not anonymous chatter online, but the work of a journalist whose reputation has been built on dismantling carefully constructed public images? That is where this story begins. Because according to multiple reports, this was the precise moment Meghan Markle realized something she had long feared but hoped would never materialize. A narrative she believed was sealed away, protected by time, reinvention, and selective memory, was about to be reopened. Publicly. Methodically. And without her consent. The man holding the key was Tom Bower. Who is Tom Bower? And why does he matter? Tom Bower is not a social media provocateur chasing clicks, is not a YouTube commentator offering speculation dressed as certainty. And he is certainly not a gossip columnist trading whispers for relevance. He is something far more unsettling to powerful figures, a veteran investigative journalist. For decades, Bower has examined the lives of people who control institutions, influence narratives, and shape public perception. Media moguls, political leaders, business titans, and members of the British royal ecosystem. His work does not rely on rumor. It relies on documentation, corroboration, and people who were there when cameras were not. Bower's reputation has been forged through an approach many journalists quietly avoid. He follows the paper trail, speaks to the people who were once useful, and then discarded. And when he publishes, he does not soften conclusions to preserve comfort. His previous book, Revenge, sent shockwaves through royal and media circles when it was released. It challenged a carefully curated public narrative surrounding Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. One centered on victimhood, institutional cruelty, and moral clarity. For some, the book was controversial. For others, it was overdue. Many assumed that was the final word. That Bower had said his piece. That the moment would pass. They were wrong. Because Bower has now shifted his focus. Not toward palace politics or royal protocol, but toward a deeper, earlier chapter of Meghan Markle's life. A chapter far removed from royal titles. Far removed from global interviews. Far removed from humanitarian branding. Her Hollywood years. And this raises an uncomfortable question. If someone's origin story changes depending on the audience, which version is real? The Hollywood years. What's being revisited? Hollywood is not a fairy tale. Despite how often success stories are framed as destiny fulfilled, the industry is brutal, transactional, and unforgiving. It runs on timing, alliances, reputation, and access. Talent matters, but rarely in isolation. According to Bower's latest reporting, Meghan Markle's rise within this system may not have followed the simple, self-made trajectory often presented to the public. Instead, he points to patterns. Doors that opened unusually fast. Opportunities that arrived without clear explanation. Connections that appeared at critical moments and disappeared once their utility had passed. Now consider this carefully. Is success any less impressive if the path behind it is more complicated than advertised? Or does the discomfort come from the contrast between the myth and the mechanics? Bower suggests that Meghan's early career involved a web of strategic relationships, some professional, some personal, that helped her navigate an industry notorious for sidelining outsiders. Sources claim that introductions mattered. That social proximity mattered. That visibility was often engineered rather than accidental. More controversially, as her career advanced, certain relationships allegedly dissolved with striking efficiency. Friends who once mattered reportedly faded from the picture. Colleagues who had provided access at one stage became irrelevant at the next. This is not an accusation of wrongdoing, it is an observation of pattern. And patterns matter when a public image is built on authenticity, resilience, and the idea of having made it alone against impossible odds. So the question becomes, is reinvention admirable, or does it become troubling when inconvenient chapters are erased rather than acknowledged? Reinvention. When life meets image. Reinvention is not unusual in Hollywood. Actors adapt. Brands evolve. Narratives are refined. But according to Bauer, Meghan Markle's transformation accelerated dramatically after one pivotal moment: meeting Prince Harry. At that point, her life did not simply change, it required reframing. Because stepping into the global spotlight as a royal partner demands more than love, it demands narrative alignment. One that balances relatability with tradition, modernity with restraint, sympathy with strength. Bauer claims that this is when elements of Meghan's past were reshaped. Details softened. Timelines blurred. Certain chapters polished to a glow. Others minimized, or quietly removed altogether. Ask yourself this. At what point does editing your story cross into rewriting it? Sources reportedly describe a deliberate effort to align Meghan's background with the image of a principled outsider, someone who overcame adversity, challenged institutions, and paid a personal price for standing firm. The concern raised by critics is not that she evolved. Evolution is natural, it is that the evolution may have been selectively curated. And for an audience increasingly sensitive to authenticity, that distinction matters. When control slips away. According to individuals familiar with the situation, Meghan was deeply unsettled when she realized how extensive Bauer's material was. This was not surface-level commentary. Not recycled interviews. Not speculative analysis. The reporting reportedly came from people who knew her personally. Individuals with access to private moments, unguarded conversations, and experiences never intended for public consumption. Which leads to a chilling realization. Someone from her past spoke. For someone known to carefully manage her public narrative, this represented a complete loss of control. Sources claim that behind the scenes, efforts were made to determine who had cooperated. Which former friends? Which associates? Which connections had resurfaced? Because when a reputation is built on consistency, even small contradictions can unravel everything. And once questions enter the public bloodstream, they do not fade easily. They multiply. What about Harry? Prince Harry is no stranger to scrutiny. But this moment is fundamentally different. Unlike the past, there is no palace infrastructure shielding him, no royal communications team crafting responses, no institution absorbing the shock. Instead, he and Meghan face public judgment as private citizens, while still operating as global brands. And the timing could not be worse. Their major U.S. ventures have struggled. The Netflix partnership failed to meet expectations. The Spotify deal ended abruptly. Lifestyle and wellness initiatives have yet to gain meaningful traction. Now ask yourself, what happens when a brand built on truth-telling is accused of selective truth? For years, the couple emphasized authenticity, transparency, and speaking their truth. That message formed the foundation of interviews, documentaries, and publishing deals. But Bauer's work threatens that foundation. If audiences begin to suspect the story was managed rather than lived, trust erodes. And once credibility weakens, rebuilding it becomes exponentially harder, especially with mature audiences who value consistency over spectacle. The family fracture. A different angle. Perhaps the most emotionally complex element of Bauer's reporting involves Meghan's relationship with her father, Thomas Markle. Publicly, the narrative has been clear: betrayal, staged photographs, media manipulation, and an irreversible breakdown. But Bauer introduces complexity. He raises questions about communication failures, escalating tensions, and narrative framing that may have favored one perspective over another. This does not absolve anyone, it complicates the picture. And that complication matters. Because Meghan's estrangement from her father has long been a cornerstone of her public image. A story of pain, betrayal, and resilience. But if parts of that story were selectively emphasized, it challenges the emotional contract formed with the public. And once again, the question arises. When a personal story becomes a public symbol, Who gets to decide which parts are true? The moment of reckoning. It is one thing to face criticism, it is another to face the collapse of a carefully curated myth. Meghan, for years, had lived inside a narrative that served her needs and supported her goals. T was a narrative built for an audience that craved heroism and authenticity. T was a narrative that positioned her as a survivor, fighter, symbol of modern resilience. But Bauer's work suggested something far more uncomfortable. What if the story was not entirely hers to control? In the quiet hours of that morning, as her phone continued to vibrate, the panic wasn't just about the book or the headlines. T was about the deeper implication. The idea that the past was not a sealed vault. T was a fragile structure built on memory, influence, and selective transparency. And now, the structure was shaking. The psychology of a public image. Public figures often forget one thing. The public does not just consume a story. The public consumes an identity. And once that identity becomes a brand, it is protected the same way companies protect trademarks. T is defended the same way politicians defend policies. T is defended the same way celebrities defend reputations. But a brand can be fragile, a brand can be attacked. And when the brand is tied to truth, the attack becomes existential. Meghan's public persona had become a symbol of courage, a symbol of reinvention, a symbol of strength. And now, the symbol was being questioned. What happens when the symbol is revealed to be a story? The art of narrative crafting. Narratives are powerful. They can transform ordinary people into icons. They can create empathy where none existed. They can turn skeptics into believers. But narratives can also be dangerous. Because they are not just stories. They are weapons. And in the hands of a skilled storyteller, they can become shields. Meghan's narrative, for many, became a shield against criticism, shield against suspicion, shield against the intense scrutiny of public life. But what happens when the shield becomes the target? What happens when the narrative is questioned? The question of motive. One of the most compelling aspects of Bauer's reporting is not simply what he claims, but why he is doing it now. Why reopen a chapter that many assumed was closed? Why challenge a narrative that has been built for years? Some suggest it is purely investigative. Some suggest it is a desire to expose the truth. But the deeper question is, what motivates a person to dig into someone's past when the person is already under public pressure? Is it justice? Is it profit? Is it revenge? Or is it simply the belief that the truth matters more than comfort? And if the truth is the goal, then what is the cost? The human side of the story. It is easy to reduce Meghan Markle to a symbol, a brand, a public figure, a subject of controversy. But behind every narrative is a person. A person who has lived the life, a person who has made choices, a person who has felt pain, a person who has tried to survive. And in this moment, the question becomes, what does it feel like to have your past reopened in public, when you have spent years trying to move forward? It is not just about reputation, it is about emotional survival. It is about the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of being judged, the fear of being reduced to a story you did not choose. The crack in the foundation. The most terrifying part of this story is not the controversy itself. It is the crack in the foundation. Because once the public begins to doubt the narrative, everything changes. Every interview, every statement, every claim. Suddenly, the past becomes a weapon, and the future becomes uncertain. The couple's brand of truth was built on the idea that they were being honest, that they were speaking openly. But if the public begins to suspect that honesty was selective, the entire brand collapses. And that collapse is not just professional. It is personal. The public's role in the story. There is another layer to this story that often gets ignored. The public is not just a spectator. The public is a participant. The public chooses what stories are believed. The public chooses what narratives are supported. The public chooses what voices are amplified. And in this case, the public is being asked to decide. Which story is true? Which narrative deserves trust? Which version of reality should be accepted? And the most difficult question of all. If the truth is messy, will the public accept it, or will they demand a simpler story? The future of the narrative. As the days pass and the headlines multiply, the story continues to evolve. New details emerge. New witnesses come forward. New questions are asked. And each new revelation changes the shape of the narrative. It becomes harder to know what is true, harder to know what is exaggerated, harder to know what is deliberately hidden. But one thing is certain. The story is no longer just about Meghan Markle. It is about the power of narrative itself. It is about the way public figures build identities. It is about the way stories are curated. It is about the way truth can be shaped to fit a purpose. And in this moment, the public is forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. We do not just consume stories. We are shaped by them. Final question. What comes next? This story is not just a scandal. It is not just a controversy. It is not just a book. It is a challenge to the idea of public truth. And now, as the world watches, one question remains. What happens when the story you built your life on begins to fall apart? Is a story still powerful if it is incomplete? The bigger question. This is no longer just a story about Meghan Markle. It is a story about image-making in the modern era. About how narratives are engineered. About how power shifts when someone outside the system begins asking uncomfortable questions. Tom Bauer does not claim moral perfection on any side. What he offers instead is scrutiny. And scrutiny is disruptive. Because once a narrative is questioned, it cannot simply be restored. So here is the question worth leaving with. In a world where stories are currency, who decides which version survives? And what happens when the past refuses to stay buried? If every public figure tells a version of their story, how do we decide which versions deserve our trust? Because once credibility becomes negotiable, everything else follows. And whether this book ultimately changes public opinion or not, one thing is certain. The conversation is no longer under anyone's control. Social media isn't just reacting anymore. It's investigating. Have you noticed the shift? This time, people aren't scrolling past headlines or reacting emotionally in comment sections. They're pausing, rewatching old interviews, comparing speeches, pulling archived clips from years ago and placing them side by side with what's being revealed today. And when you look closely, really closely, things start to feel off. So here's the question worth asking right at the start. When public stories stop lining up with the record, who decides what's true? That question sits at the center of the current storm surrounding Meghan Markle. Across platforms, longtime supporters and critics alike are revisiting her past statements with fresh eyes. Old clips are resurfacing, not as gossip, but as evidence. Timelines are being scrutinized. Details that once felt emotional and persuasive are now being analyzed logically. Dates don't quite match. Accounts subtly shift depending on the audience. And once those inconsistencies are spotted, they're hard to unsee. What's striking is who's going quiet. The loudest skepticism isn't just coming from critics. It's coming from people who once defended her fiercely. Accounts that used to jump into comment sections to shut down criticism are now silent, or worse, questioning. You can see it in the tone. Did we miss something? Was this exaggerated? Why does this sound different now? For a public figure, that shift is dangerous. Supporters don't need to turn hostile for damage to occur. All they need to do is stop believing. And belief, once shaken, rarely returns easily. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the British press has gone into overdrive. If you've followed UK tabloids for decades, you already know how this works. They wait. They watch. And when they sense blood in the water, they move fast. Headlines are sharper. Language is more confident. This isn't framed as rumor. It's framed as revelation. And unlike past media frenzies built largely on speculation, this time the coverage leans heavily on documented detail, sourcing, and long-form investigation. That distinction matters. Because rumors fade. Documentation sticks. At the center of this renewed attention is author Tom Bauer, whose work has forced a re-examination of stories many assumed were settled. His reporting doesn't rely on viral soundbites or anonymous online chatter. It's built on interviews, records, and first-hand accounts. Information that suggests access to people who actually knew Meghan before fame, before royalty, before the carefully managed image. And that's where things turn personal. Behind the gates of the Montecito estate, sources describe a household under intense strain. Staff reportedly uneasy. Advisors in constant motion. Phones ringing early and late as crisis teams scramble to stay ahead of a story that refuses to slow down. Imagine waking up to alerts that don't stop. Messages from friends warning you about what's about to drop. Headlines multiplying faster than responses can be drafted. According to insiders, this wasn't treated as a routine PR challenge. This was full-scale damage control from the start. Why? Because this wasn't a single allegation that could be denied or reframed. It was a pattern. And patterns are harder to dismiss. One insider described the atmosphere as tense and chaotic. Less about anger, more about shock. The recurring question wasn't, how do we respond? But rather, how does he know this? That question changes everything. Because the level of detail involved goes beyond public record. These weren't facts you could assemble by reading old articles or watching archived interviews. They involved private conversations, personal motivations, and behind-closed-doors moments. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Someone talked. Possibly more than one person. And once that idea takes hold, paranoia follows. Was it former staff? Palace aides who felt mistreated or silenced during the royal years? Hollywood colleagues left behind after success reshaped social circles? The entertainment industry is notorious for loose loyalties once power dynamics shift. Or, most unsettling of all, could it have been family? That question has quietly dominated speculation. Thomas Markle's name continues to surface, not because of proof, but because of proximity. The family dynamics described are so specific, so emotionally textured, that many observers ask the same thing. Who else would remember events that way? At the same time, Meghan's half-sister Samantha has been posting cryptic messages online. Statements that feel less like coincidence and more like commentary. Gratitude expressed toward unnamed truth-tellers. Comments implying vindication. You don't need to be an investigator to understand how this looks. Now pause for a moment and consider this. What happens psychologically when a person realizes their inner circle may not be as loyal as they believed? According to sources, Meghan has been consumed by that question. Phone calls. Reaching out. Asking indirectly. Trying to identify where the leaks might be coming from. Because if information truly came from inside the family, that's not just reputational damage. It's emotional devastation. And then there's Harry. Caught between loyalty and exhaustion. Those close to the couple say he's deeply frustrated, not just by the press, but by the cycle itself. Every few months, another book. Another documentary. Another round of scrutiny. The peaceful life he hoped for in California has instead become an endless loop of defense and fallout. Their home, once framed as a retreat, is now described as heavy with tension. Conversations strained. Silence longer. Stress lingering in ways neither can escape. And here's the thing many people miss. This isn't about one book. It's about what happens when a public image, carefully constructed over years, begins to fracture under sustained examination. Bauer's reporting didn't stop at royal life or Hollywood networking. It went further back. Childhood, education, early career decisions. The formative years that shape identity. And according to individuals from those periods, the person they knew doesn't always align with the narrative later presented to the public. Not in success. That part is undeniable. But in origin stories. In hardship accounts. In how certain struggles were framed. If that's true, it creates a dangerous ripple effect. Because once people begin questioning the foundation, everything built on top becomes unstable. Ask yourself. If one part of a story doesn't hold up, how much of the rest do you trust? That's the position Meghan now faces. This isn't a case of public opinion shifting overnight. It's erosion. Slow. Relentless. Each article, each comparison clip, each former supporter asking a quiet question adds another crack. And the problem with cracks is that they spread. Once credibility wavers, every past interview gets replayed differently. Speeches about authenticity sound rehearsed. Statements meant to inspire feel calculated. Even silence becomes suspicious. At her peak, Meghan occupied a rare position. Global visibility, elite platforms, corporate partnerships, and influence across media, politics, and culture. Few people ever reach that level of attention. But attention cuts both ways. Now, those same platforms are being used to reassess her entire public journey. Not with emotion, but with scrutiny. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Her biggest challenge isn't Tom Bower. It isn't the British tabloids. It isn't even online critics. It's history. Because history doesn't respond to press releases. It doesn't care about branding. It doesn't adjust itself to fit a narrative. You can manage perception for a while. You can guide the story. But if the past doesn't align with the version presented, it eventually resurfaces. Piece by piece. Voice by voice. And once that process begins, stopping it is nearly impossible. So where does this leave her? Some believe recovery is still possible. Public memory can be short. New projects can redirect attention. Strategic silence can sometimes work. Others see this as a turning point. The moment when a carefully curated image gives way to a more complicated, less controlled public understanding. And that leads us to the question everyone is asking now. Is this a temporary storm, or the beginning of the end of Meghan Markle's carefully constructed public identity? Can she rebuild trust once doubt takes root? Or has the narrative finally slipped beyond her control? That answer hasn't arrived yet. But one thing is clear. The conversation has changed, and it's not going back. Yet the most unsettling part of all is not the criticism. It's the sense that the story has been incomplete all along. That the version of the past we were told was only half the truth. That the narrative we believed was not necessarily a lie, but a carefully edited truth. And that raises the most dangerous question of all. If the story is incomplete, who benefits from its incompleteness? Who gains from the public not knowing the full picture? Who is protected when the narrative stays controlled? And who is harmed? Because in modern culture, image isn't just a personal reputation. It is political power, cultural influence, financial leverage, a brand. And once a brand is challenged, it isn't just a personal fall. It becomes a public event, a lesson, a warning, a spectacle. And then, there is the public itself. What does it mean when the audience becomes the investigator? When the watchers no longer passively consume, but actively interrogate? When people no longer accept the story at face value? When the question is no longer what happened, but what was hidden? This is a new era. The era where the story isn't simply told. It's tested. And the outcome isn't decided by the person who tells it. It's decided by the collective scrutiny of millions. So the final question is not just about Meghan Markle. It's about all of us. In a world where stories are currency, who decides which version survives? And what happens when the past refuses to stay buried? Because once credibility becomes negotiable, everything else follows. And once a story is questioned, it can never return to the shape it once had. Not completely. Not ever. The conversation has changed. And now the world is watching, not just to see what happens next, but to see what the truth finally looks like when the editing is removed.